My name is Monica Reyes. I'm 45 years old, and this was my 68th interview in 11 months. I had once been the regional strategy director for North and South America at a Fortune 100 company. Now, I sat across from a hiring manager half my age, watching him circle my resume with a red pen like he was correcting a student's essay. He didn't bother to look up when he said he found some of my achievements hard to believe. I kept my posture straight, jaw tight, heart steady. After all, I had led cross-continental teams, turned around entire markets, and doubled revenue in under a year. But none of that seemed to matter here. He smirked as he read aloud my experience in Southeast Asia. His tone made it sound like I'd claimed to walk on water. I stayed quiet, letting the silence sit, but inside something clenched hard. I wanted to tell him about the 300-hour work weeks, the nights I slept on office floors, and the lives changed because of what we built, but I didn't. I had learned not to explain too much. Too much sounded defensive. Too little sounded evasive. There was no right amount of brilliance when the person across the table had already decided you were lying. He put down the paper and said something about culture fit and how younger teams needed agile thinkers. The insult was wrapped in corporate fluff. I took a breath, measured, and was calm. I told him that every accomplishment on that page was earned, not exaggerated, that I'd built that portfolio with more than just numbers. It was built with grit, precision, and vision. He glanced at his watch like I was wasting his time. Then the door opened. It wasn't a knock. It was a confident push. A tall man in a tailored navy suit stepped inside, looked around the room, and then froze when he saw me. For a second, I wasn't sure if he recognized me or was about to ask for directions, but then he broke into a wide, surprised smile. "Is that Monica Reyes?" he asked, stepping forward. "The woman who single-handedly saved Sterling Organics from losing its entire product line 2 years ago. You're interviewing here." He turned to the hiring manager, who suddenly looked much smaller in his chair. "If she joins your team," he said, "I'm quadrupling my contract with your firm." I didn't move. My pulse roared in my ears, but I held my breath. The hiring manager blinked, stammered, and tried to recall something on my resume. But the power dynamic had shifted. The person he had just dismissed as an embellished applicant was now the key to a multi-million-dollar deal. David Sterling, one of the most respected CEOs in the clean food industry, pulled out a chair and sat beside me like we were equals. Because we were. He spoke easily, recalling my work. My strategy that turned his regional chaos into global dominance. The room suddenly felt too quiet. The hiring manager tried to recover, but it was too late. Every doubt he had flung at me minutes earlier now sounded ridiculous. I looked straight ahead, lips closed, heart pounding. All I could think was how long I had waited for someone to see what I already knew. I had never needed validation. But damn, it felt good to finally get it. It didn't happen all at once. The shift was subtle at first, like a cold draft creeping into a warm room. Meetings I used to lead became ones I was invited to, then optional, then forgotten. The new CEO arrived with perfect hair and polished buzzwords. He shook my hand, complimented my track record, then hinted that we were entering a bold new era. I didn't understand what that meant until I watched 3 female directors quietly vanish from the org chart in less than 6 weeks. No announcements, no farewells, just disappearance by reorganization. When it was my turn, the conversation was quick. They said the company was moving in a different direction, that I didn't quite fit the new leadership chemistry. A carefully crafted phrase designed to sound objective, but soaked in exclusion. I sat there nodding even as my pulse pounded. I had driven double-digit growth across 3 continents. My team had won global innovation awards. But none of that seemed to matter now that the room was full of old college friends and golf buddies who happened to be men. They offered me a generous severance package loaded with legalese and silence clauses. It was too much for someone they claimed was no longer a fit, which told me everything. I signed with a steady hand and walked out with my head high, but the shame followed me home. For the first week, I kept telling myself it was a blessing, that I needed a break time to think, space to breathe. But beneath that lie was a quiet panic that I didn't say out loud. Every day, I opened my laptop and stared at the blinking cursor on my resume. Where do you begin? when the very thing that defined you, your competence, your leadership, your results, was just erased by a few words and a signature. The hardest part wasn't losing the job. It felt like I'd been erased, like I had been cut out of a story I helped write. My calendar went from triple booked to empty. My phone stopped ringing. Colleagues I mentored avoided my calls. Invitations dried up. I didn't just lose a title. I lost visibility. I lost proof. What no one tells you is how quickly relevance can slip through your fingers when power changes hands. Especially if you're a woman who has held it too long. The men who replaced me weren't better. They were just better connected. And I was no longer useful to anyone who wanted to stay in the new CEO's good graces. So I sat in that silence, day after day, wondering where all that loyalty, all that work, all that success had gone. It didn't feel like a door had closed. It felt like the room I built had been emptied, repainted, and renamed without a trace of me left behind. Somewhere around my 25th interview, I stopped bringing my portfolio. It felt pointless. No one was reading it anyway. I'd walk into these rooms, sometimes sleek offices, sometimes noisy cafes, and the moment they saw me, something shifted. Their eyes flicked up from my resume to my face, then quickly down again. I could see the mental math. Over 40. Too seasoned. Probably set in her ways. They never said it out loud. Instead, they asked questions loaded with suspicion. Tell us about a time you adapted to a younger, more agile team. How would you handle reporting to someone 10 years your junior? Where do you see yourself fitting in with a fast-paced, forward-thinking culture? I had the answers. Of course I did. I'd led global campaigns with cross-generational teams across 5 time zones. I'd mentored executives who now sat on boards. But none of that mattered because the narrative in their heads had already been written before I spoke. They weren't looking for expertise. They were looking for validation of a type. Someone who looked like their idea of potential. And that someone didn't look like me anymore. Rejection stopped hurting after the 30th round. It turned numb. I'd leave the building, pass by the mirror in the elevator, and barely recognize the woman looking back. I wasn't less skilled. I was just less visible. The hardest part wasn't the no's. It was the silence. The thank you for coming emails that came hours later, always polite, always generic. The phone interviews that never moved forward. The meetings where they smiled, but their eyes said, "You're not what we expected." Every rejection chipped away at something I'd spent decades building. Not just a career, but belief. The belief that being excellent was enough. I started questioning my instincts, second-guessing every word I said in the room. Did I smile too little? Too much? Was my confidence coming off as arrogance, or was I simply not what they wanted to see? Some nights I stared at job boards for hours, not because I was applying, just because I wanted to feel like I still belonged somewhere, that someone might still need what I knew. I missed being seen, not just looked at, but really seen. I missed having my ideas spark a whiteboard session. I missed teams who trusted me, who challenged me, who built with me. Mostly, I missed the version of me who believed this dry spell was just temporary. But I kept showing up, even when the silence got louder, even when it felt like I had become invisible in a world I once helped shape. I kept going because something deep inside whispered that being unseen didn't mean being unworthy. It just meant I had more to prove. The room was silent. The kind of silence that follows a flat dismissal, the kind that sticks to your skin. The hiring manager had just finished telling me they were looking for someone with more recent experience in digital-first ecosystems. I kept my expression calm, nodding slowly even as my stomach twisted. I could feel it coming, the polite wrap-up, the thin smiles, the thank you for your time routine. I had heard it all before. I was already bracing myself when the door burst open. A man in a tailored navy suit walked in like he owned the place. Confident, composed, unaware of the awkward tension he'd just interrupted. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on me, and for a second I thought maybe he was lost. But then his expression changed. He stopped mid-stride. His face lit up with recognition. "Monica Reyes," he said loud enough to freeze everyone in the room. "Is that really you?" His tone was full of disbelief and excitement, as if he'd just found something precious he hadn't even realized he'd lost. I nodded slowly. The hiring manager looked between us, confused. David Sterling, the man who now stood in the middle of the room, stepped closer. "This woman," he said, turning to the others, "is the reason Sterling Organics didn't go under 2 years ago. When every consultant told us to abandon our product line, Monica was the only one who saw a path forward." And she was right. The room shifted. You could feel it. Chairs creaked, eyes widened. The dismissive glances I'd endured moments earlier vanished, replaced by sudden interest, maybe even fear. David looked at the hiring manager and asked one simple question. "Is she joining your team? Because if she is, we're tripling our contract. And if she's not, we're walking. Plain and simple." He folded his arms and waited for an answer. No one spoke. The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again. He reached for my resume, suddenly studying it like it held buried treasure. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, heart racing. I hadn't expected this. I didn't plan for it. But every cell in my body felt the shift. For months I had carried the weight of being overlooked, of being questioned, doubted, and quietly dismissed. And now, in one unexpected moment, the narrative flipped. Not because I explained myself better, not because I changed who I was, but because someone powerful finally said out loud what I had known all along. I should have smiled. I should have looked triumphant. But I didn't. I stayed still, letting the weight of that recognition land, letting them all sit in the uncomfortable truth that their assumptions had just been shattered. David turned back to me and said he had hoped we'd work together again someday. Then he nodded and left as abruptly as he came. But the damage or redemption had already been done. The manager stammered something about revisiting the offer. His tone was new, softer, and deferential. He asked if I'd be open to discussing a more senior role. I looked at him not unkindly and said I'd think about it. Inside, though, something had already shifted. I didn't need this job to feel whole. I didn't need their offer to prove anything. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt undeniable. And that changed everything. The offer came the next morning. It was everything a professional in my position was supposed to want. Senior strategy partner, a salary 20% above the market, full relocation performance bonuses, a private office, and a team of analysts. The email was full of praise. They admired my expertise, respected my vision, and looked forward to what I could bring to the firm. All things they hadn't mentioned when they thought I was just another overqualified, outdated applicant. I stared at the screen for a long time. The number was tempting. It would erase the anxiety in my bank account. It would give me back structure, status, and a daily rhythm. But it didn't feel right. I thought about how fast they changed their tune once David spoke, how nothing about me had changed in that room except who was willing to vouch for me. The job itself wasn't an apology. It was a transaction. A business decision made under pressure. That night I sat in my apartment surrounded by printouts, notes, and the silence I'd grown used to. My phone buzzed with a message from Lena, one of my closest friends from the old company. She had been pushed out the same month I was. Brilliant, empathetic, with an eye for emerging markets like no one I'd ever met. And yet no one had stepped up for her. No client had walked in to vouch for her brilliance. I thought of all the women like Lena, all the people who were excellent but unseen, who didn't get saved by a timely entrance from a powerful ally, who walked out of rooms holding their resumes like shields and hoped anyone, would just look closer. If I took that job, I'd be walking right back into a world that only values proof when it comes from power. I'd be reinforcing the very thing I claimed to stand against. I'd be telling every woman watching that the only way out is to be lucky enough to be rescued. I couldn't do that. Not anymore. The next day, I met with Ava and Jolene, two former colleagues I trusted deeply. We sat at a corner cafe for hours, scribbling ideas on napkins and laptops. We talked about building a firm that didn't just value data, but also valued people who see the world differently. A firm that wouldn't need David Sterling to translate someone's worth. We didn't have funding, We didn't have an office, but we had something else: experience, vision, and the unshakable knowledge that if we waited for the system to change, we'd be waiting forever. So I wrote a polite email declining the offer. I thanked them for their time. Then I closed my laptop and exhaled. That moment wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was the most powerful choice I'd made in years. I wasn't going to fight my way back into someone else's definition of legitimacy. I was going to build something of my own, starting from zero, on my terms. We called it Thrive Bridge. The name came from something Ava said in that first meeting. We're not just helping companies grow. We're building bridges between ideas and impact between talent and trust. We started small: 1 folding table, 3 laptops, and enough coffee to power a newsroom. Our headquarters were Jolene's converted attic, with uneven floors and a view of the alley. But the energy was electric. We decided from day one that we weren't going to copy what we'd left behind. No hierarchy for hierarchy's sake. No consultants hired for pedigree instead of perspective. We wanted people who saw patterns where others saw noise. Who understood culture not from textbooks but from lived experience. Our first hires didn't come from Ivy League campuses or LinkedIn recommendations. They came from places recruiters usually ignore. A math teacher who'd switched to data science in her 50s. A recent grad from a community college who built a predictive model for refugee supply chains. A former barista with uncanny customer insight and a mind for systems. We didn't ask for perfect resumes. We gave them real problems to solve. And they did, better than we imagined. Our model focused on strategic clarity rooted in real-world data, not just charts and projections, but behavior. We spent time in markets others dismissed. Talked to people at every level of the value chain. We blended analytics with emotional intelligence, intuition with structure. Clients were hesitant at first. We didn't look like the glossy teams they were used to. We didn't speak in jargon or promise miracle fixes, but then they saw our work. One regional retailer jumped 6 points in market share in 3 months after implementing our recommendations. Another restructured their onboarding process based on insights from our customer empathy audits and cut churn by 40%. Thrive Bridge was working, not in spite of our differences, but because of them. Every person at the table had been told at some point that they didn't belong, so we made a place where they could belong, and they gave us everything they had. The most radical thing we did wasn't the strategy, it was the hiring. We made it a policy to value voice over background, and it changed the way we thought, built, and showed up. Thrive Bridge wasn't just a firm, it was a quiet revolution, and it was just getting started. The conference was packed. Every major player in strategy consulting was there. Thrive Bridge had secured a 15-minute slot on a secondary stage. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We presented on underestimated talent and invisible markets, how the biggest opportunities were hiding in places traditional firms refused to look. We didn't speak with buzzwords. We spoke with data, stories, and results. The room kept filling. By the end, people were standing in the back. When we finished, there was a beat of silence before the applause. Then someone from the front row stood up. It was Gerard Walsh, CEO of TGR. He said our methodology challenged everything his teams had believed. He asked if we were taking new clients. I told him we were selective. After the session, his assistant asked to schedule a meeting. That night I sat across from Gerard and their strategy head, trying not to smile too hard. They offered to acquire Thrive Bridge, a full buyout, premium valuation, executive titles for me and both co-founders. I listened politely. Then I laid out my condition. I would consider selling, but only if I had full control over TGR's recruitment and talent evaluation systems. Complete authority. No filters. No legacy protocols. I would rebuild it from the inside. They froze. Gerard looked stunned. His colleague asked if I was joking. I wasn't. This wasn't about money. It was about power. The power to stop what had happened to me from happening again. The power to rewrite the rules that once shut me out. We went back and forth for hours. They pushed. I held firm. Finally, Gerard asked what made me so sure this overhaul would work. I opened my laptop and showed them our results. The projects, the hires, the markets we'd unlocked. Data they couldn't argue with. Silence stretched between us. Then Gerard exhaled. He extended his hand. "We have a deal," he said. I shook it calm and measured. But inside I felt the kind of satisfaction no title ever gave me. TGR didn't just want ThriveBridge. They needed it. And the woman they once dismissed now held the pen to their future. Not out of revenge. Out of proof. Proof that systems can change when the right people are finally in the room. On my first day as Chief Talent Strategist at TGR, I walked through the glass doors not as a guest, not as a candidate, but as the architect of something new. The lobby looked the same, but everything had changed. This time, I wasn't asking for a seat. I had built the table. We started with a quiet overhaul. We rewrote job descriptions to focus on capability instead of pedigree. We designed assessments that reflected real challenges instead of hypothetical jargon. We opened doors that had been bolted shut for decades. In the first quarter, teams, hired through our new framework, outperformed legacy hires across every metric. Retention was higher. Innovation scores climbed. Clients noticed the difference, and so did the board. Philomena avoided me at first. She still held her title, but her influence had shifted. One afternoon, she asked to meet. She sat across from me, composed, but quieter than I remembered. She said she'd reviewed every candidate she had once passed over. The data was undeniable. Some of our strongest performers had been people she had dismissed without a second thought, including me. There was no dramatic apology, just a pause. A soft acknowledgement that something in her judgment had been flawed. And in that space, I didn't feel bitter. I felt clarity. This wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving the system could be better, stronger, fairer. And I was proud to be the one building it. 6 months in, we launched a mentorship track pairing unconventional hires with senior leadership. Our model spread. Other departments adopted it. Soon our competitors started calling. They wanted to know how we were hiring so well. The press wrote stories. Clients doubled down. But what mattered most were the quiet messages. People I had never met who wrote to say they finally felt seen. That they'd been told they didn't belong until now. One evening, I walked past the same conference room where I had once been questioned, doubted, and sized up. It was empty now, but the echo remained, not as a scar, but as a reminder. Growth isn't just upward. Sometimes it's inward. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand firm until the ground shifts beneath you. I didn't build a team. I built a mirror. One that reflects back the kind of excellence no resume alone can capture. The kind that's lived earned and too often ignored. So, if you're waiting for someone to validate your worth, don't. Don't wait for the room to recognize you. Don't wait for the gate to open. Build your own bridge. Light your own path. Create your own proof.